Welcome to Critical Junction, episode 40. I'm Mark.
I'm Luke.
I'm Jill.
And University of Toronto psychology professor and Kermit the Frog impersonator Jordan Peterson made headlines in 2016 when he vocally opposed Bill C-16, the government's legislation that added protection of gender identity and expression to the Canadian Human Rights Code, arguing the bill was ideologically motivated and was an infringement upon freedom of expression. Since then, Peterson has risen to infamy virtually overnight, earning accolades from the extreme right, who see him as some kind of messiah standing up for free speech, and condemnation from the social justice warriors on the extreme left, who, in their trademark brand of knee-jerk reactionism, have branded him public enemy number one in their political correctness campaign. While some of Peterson's comments have been thoroughly misconstrued by the media, much of what he says is nonetheless quite divisive. Consider, for example, his anti-gender spectrum assertion. According to Peterson, arguments that biology does not determine gender, quote, stem from the humanities and are entirely ideologically driven, end quote. Also consider the video that circulated of him refusing to use a student's preferred pronoun, which hints at Peterson's right-wing, socially conservative position. Peterson has also expressed his frustration with the so-called new atheists like Sam Harris, arguing the central problem with human beings is not religion, but rather tribalism. While this argument is superficially attractive, Peterson goes on to cast a false dichotomy of the absolute nihilism of atheism versus what he calls the apogee within Christianity of the idea of the divine individual. Along similar lines, though, Peterson has said he does not like being asked whether he believes in God, saying he refuses to be boxed into one side or the other of a binary question. He also questions whether those who ask him whether he believes in God actually know what they mean by believe or God. Unfortunately for Peterson, belief in God is a binary question. Either one does or does not believe. Either a God exists or it doesn't. If you accept the proposition that it does, you believe. If you reject the proposition that a God exists, even if you're uncertain, then you don't believe. The danger with Peterson's continued provocation of the left and others, intentional or otherwise, is that he adds the apparent credibility of an academic to the usual right-wing blowhard paranoia about moral decay and the collapse of society, making it easy for disenfranchised young men to flock to his message. So, is Jordan Peterson the antichrist social justice warriors have painted him as, or is he, as many others have suggested, simply the stupid man's intellectual? Or does he fit comfortably somewhere in between? Let's talk about that, shall we?
I'm not sure he's even in between either of those two alternatives that you proposed there. I think there's room for him to be an earnest thinker of a flavor other than the sort of left-leaning secularist kind of flavor that most sort of legitimate thinkers or legitimized thinkers have, or at least public intellectuals. Who other than Noam Chomsky would be considered like big name public intellectuals
that's
right
still
now?
alive? Or?
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of people would consider Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and the likes of them.
Right.
Slavoj.
Hitchens,
Slavoj in there?
Yeah. Slavoj Žižek, yeah.
As I nod. Yes.
Would you consider him to be a public intellectual?
Slavoj Žižek, well, maybe not, eh? He's more just a philosopher that some media have turned their attention to, but he doesn't seem to seek out being a public intellectual.
I don't think he's like...
Seek out the mantle of public intellectual.
Right.
But anyway, so I mean, I think he does have a lot of expertise and education and knowledge.
Oh, for sure. Like
about the sort of philosophical lines that he mostly explores.
Yeah, like don't get me wrong. He's an accomplished psychologist, like a clinical psychologist. You know, he's a smart guy. He's very quick-witted. He knows what he's talking about for the most part. But just a lot of what he says remains, for a lot of people, polarizing. Right.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if that's entirely because the left is so reactionary to what he has to say, because a lot of what they're reacting to is oftentimes taken out of context, like that video that I was mentioning in the introduction, right? That's just one instance or one tiny portion of a longer conversation that he was having with his student. And the only thing the social justice warriors glommed onto was his refusal to use those pronouns. Like, we don't know what happened before or after that.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of boils down to a bad faith denial of the explicit motives that he states for his unwillingness to comply with the whole pronoun issue, right? I say bad faith because his actual argument is saying that it's a point of principle that no government should ever be able to tell someone which words come out of your mouth, right? This is essentially what he's saying, and he brings up the fact that if you can get fined for not using a particular word and don't pay the fine, then you can go to jail ultimately. This is just on a point of principle, the government shouldn't have the power to compel speech, right? Or to, no matter how benign that speech might be, or not even benign, but how kind of noble the motive for
Protective motive, yeah.
Right. So it's been a bad faith reaction because they're saying that explicit rationale and argumentation that he's presenting for that is not actually what he means. What he means is that he wants to be able to I don't know, trollishly or just maliciously use a pronoun other than the one that a transgender person accepts for themselves. So they're and they want to say that his motive is that he's bigoted against transgenders generally, which it might be the case, but what they're doing is just making like an attribution kind of fallacy there, because they're just insisting that that's the case without necessarily being able to conclude that is the case.
Right. It's it's conclusions based on something else. Like I think he Like, what do you think about that? About the explicit motive that I'm talking about here, which is the principle of the government not being allowed to compel. Well, I think
some kind of speech.
I think he's on to something there, and to other people it appeared to represent something else, and he certainly didn't deter from that. He continued just saying what he had to say, and other people continued saying.
That's the
and
problem.
It was just two different conversations.
Yeah, that's
that
where
didn't meet in the middle anywhere, and I mean that's also his fault as
exactly
well.
Exactly.
He let this happen, and
these are at the core
of that like
of
a surfer
kind of
on a
issues
wave and became popular by it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, he's definitely banking on the popularity he garnered from that action. He's still milking it. Like his lectures are sold out and they're packed.
I mean, isn't that kind of similar to like what caused the backlash with Trump after the Charlottesville thing, where Trump is like, there's bad people on all sides, right. Basically implying there's good people on all sides, including the neo-Nazis.
Yeah, and he didn't explicitly condemn what happened, and that was the blowback from
that.
it. Right?
That's it. And to some extent, the Peterson phenomenon has an element of that too, because it's of course it's obvious that the Kekistanis and the right-wing trolls and explicit kind of nationalist, white nationalist groups and stuff have glommed onto him, and he hasn't necessarily made much of an effort to denounce that kind of. He
hasn't necessarily denounced their actions, but he has said that he disagrees with the radicals on both the left and the right.
Yeah, right.
But again, he didn't explicitly condemn the actions of
well, exactly. And if you're going to look at it, if you're going to look at it fairly, he definitely does speak out a lot about the radical on the left side, but almost
Rarely,
never speaks
right.
out directly about the radical on the right side.
Yeah, and I think that's another point where
He says he's against the radicals on both sides, but he only actually
condemns
directly condemns one.
right, and a lot of people on the right flock to him because of his lack of condemnation, right?
Yeah.
And because they're attracted to the message that he's putting out there with his refusal to, use preferred pronouns or whatever else.
Well, he's speaking on behalf of norms, right? He is saying the established norms are this, and this is what I will speak on behalf of.
Yeah.
And anything new is just not established yet, so I will not use these terms
Yeah.
until they have become norms. And then I guess maybe I'll use them,
Yeah.
It seems like that's where he's coming from.
Maybe, yeah. The sort of the substance of his overarching idea or worldview that he's putting forward is that he's criticizing the postmodern neglect of sort of underlying social institutions and structures and ideas that have sort of a purpose or a role in society that might actually be useful, but that are being dismissed without any concern for the consequences to society because they're seen as flawed, and so the postmodernists just want to destroy some kind of traditional idea that is flawed, but they don't actually care to put the work into thinking about like what's going to replace that or whether or not that was serving some kind of deeper function, even though it transgresses some other kind of idea of justice that
All in all,
might well be
you're
supportable.
suggesting he fears change. He fears this chaos thing is what it seems to
so
be the case.
He is
He's
socially
very concerned
conservative.
about
Yeah,
chaos.
on a level, on a certain level, he's kind of championing a traditionalist kind of view, right?
Well,
Yeah.
would it not be a traditionalist patriarchal view? And I'm thinking of it symbolically in terms of psychology.
Maybe incidentally, that's what the consequence is, but he might not necessarily. He might not necessarily be arguing for specifically a patriarchal institution or
Yeah,
or,
but like
or-
if you look at his defense of traditional values and that kind of thing, then just by default, those traditional values have been deeply rooted in patriarchal family types.
which he is afraid will be dismantled.
yeah, he's concerned with like the nuclear family construction and stuff like that. But he seems to also be open to sort of an evolutionary construction of these kinds of patterns in societies.
It sounds
Right.
like what he's saying is, I'm going to hold on to these as long as I can, and I'm going to be a bitch about letting them go. Is what he's basically saying.
Well, that's kind of reductive of what he's saying. I think what he's saying is
Well, it's a short podcast, so you got to be reductive.
sure, but what he's also saying is not that he wants to hold on to them arbitrarily because he's afraid. He's saying if you want to make important changes, then actually have the conscientiousness to also be willing to think about the consequences of it and the purposes or the causes or the reasons for what you're getting rid of.
That presupposes that that's possible and that one can foresee all these changes and stuff. Like, really, it is
Yeah, I think
just
that's
I'm
a valid
scared.
that's a
I'm
valid
scared,
problem.
is what he's saying.
Yeah, but I don't know if that's all he's saying.
Right.
I think it's
I think he has an argument for why some specific things that are being dismantled might have been important.
Like, I can't
Or
help
might
but
be
think
important.
that his argument is always posited in defense of what he has established for himself, his academic life and all of that stuff. Like, I can't help but feel like he's threatened. and very reactionary. Does this make sense?
I think
it's too easy. That may be the case, but I think it's too easy to dismiss all of the reasoned argumentation that he's presenting.
Yeah.
He's presenting an argument that needs to be dissected and rebutted, but that nobody wants to take the time to do that because it seems a lot more virtuous to just dismiss what he says as being reactionary and against the left, and you can just dismiss him as being just a patriarchal apologist. But I don't think that's fair.
To point this out. Yeah, okay. So what is his argument? Like, are we talking about this book that he's written with like?
Yeah, 12, I don't know. I haven't read the book, and like I don't know much more than either of you guys do about him, other than some of the interviews and videos that I watched.
Right.
Online.
Yeah. Like I haven't read the book either. I only know certain little passages from it that have circulated through,
But I mean, most people have that level of a familiarity with him if they're exposed to him at all.
Yeah,
most people are going to come up with are going to glean something from it. Right.
I take issue with people criticizing him outright and dismissing his ideas just based on the superficial information that they have, right? They haven't read the book, they haven't gone to any of his lectures, they haven't listened to his interviews, but they just know that he doesn't want to use these pronouns, so he has to be a dick, right? Forget anything he might have to say that's of any value, and just throw him out because he's being a bigot.
Yeah. To me, it seemed very evident that he's just having a different conversation. He's not trying to insult anyone. He's just trying to say you can't legislate this.
Right. Yeah. And see, I agree with that in principle. The government should not legislate what somebody can and can't say, and that's fine. Like I support that argument. But the problem I have with him, my criticism is directly related to his religious apologism. Right? He's a presuppositionalist in a lot of ways.
I watched a little bit of the Dillahunty video that you mentioned to me yesterday, and he makes that argument that atheists actually believe in God even though they don't know it.
That's the exact argument that I have a really big problem with, because he says that atheists who proclaim that they don't believe in God actually do, because you can tell by their actions, right? People like Sam Harris, and this is an example he used directly. Sam Harris isn't going out around and shooting people despite the fact that he proclaims himself to be an atheist. So he says he doesn't believe, but his metaphysics are, and this is a direct quote more or less from what he was saying, Sam Harris's metaphysics are inherently Christian. Right? And he's acting within that framework, even though he says he's an atheist and doesn't believe.
Well, it may very well be so that someone is working within a certain framework, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they believe something. They may be just following a framework or something like that. So
that's what I don't get. He seems to be able to understand and sometimes agree with like evolutionary sort of models of emergent and spontaneous kind of things, structures or values or something like that. But ultimately he then turns around and denies that these things can be purely emergent, and says that the only reason why they're emerging is because there's metaphysically a pre-existing sort of revealed morality or value system underneath there that then causes it to emerge in the actuality of societies afterwards. Do you know what I'm saying? Is that clear?
It's a classic religious apologist argument.
Well, it's basically divine command theory.
Exactly. And like he's making an assertion without having any kind of evidence to back it up, which I find odd coming from a trained clinical PhD psychologist, right? Like,
who seems to believe in God.
Well, that's like I said during the intro there, he doesn't like being asked whether he believes in God because he doesn't want to be boxed into a binary question. It is a binary question. Like, either you do or you don't believe. There is no in between when it comes to do you believe a God exists.
But in a sense, he's suggesting that there is unconscious factors at play that he's not privy to. Is maybe that what he's suggesting?
He's saying that those unconscious factors are in fact transcendent and are part of a larger metaphysical emergent framework, I think is what he called it. Like he's saying that it's God without saying it's God.
But he's saying this in terms of himself and each individual, or he's saying emerging as a structured reality that is a solid thing.
So there, the common values that we can sort of glean from humanity, like sort of moral kind of truths or whatever that we'll see kind of pop up across societies in humanity generally. Those are things that they have not because there's a reason for them, not because only that evolutionarily the ones who hold them are more likely to persist and be able to reproduce their genetic makeup, but because outside of humanity and reality altogether, there's a set of values there, and these are just manifesting that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like he I can't remember what I was going to say there. Damn it. But yeah, like he does hold presuppositionalist ideas. That among them, like morality is essentially rooted in like a higher transcendent metaphysical kind of thing.
I only watched a little bit of that Dilhanti discussion. Mm-hmm. Does he actually directly go and attack the presuppositionalist
at the end
concept directly? Because he had that big debate with Cy ten Bruggencate, who is explicitly a presuppositionalist Christian apologist.
At the end of the discussion, he wraps up his thoughts on Peterson, and he says, like, he hasn't presented anything I haven't heard before. It's the same. I think he even mentions Cy directly.
Okay.
But he says, like, this is the classic presuppositionalist argument. It's couched in like more refined language, but it's still the same principle. It's just a baseless assertion. Like, if I'm going to say I don't believe in God, you need to take me at my word when I say that, and not just say that, well, you're just saying you don't believe.
Well, no, but there's also nothing wrong with pointing out that you may actually believe if you do believe, because there is possibly unconscious factors at work, and that someone that claims they're not a believer may actually be a believer and not realize that they have this framework that they've been dealing with and stuff like that, I mean,
but consciously, if you're expressing a belief or a lack of a belief, right? Well, you just, for sake of argument, just take that person at their word, right? Like,
I have heard the opposite argument as well from atheists about theists, that theists don't actually believe because of the way they cherry pick some of the
like
pivotal points of the theological like framework or system theory that they're living by, or that they're espousing, at least.
In either case, it's a bad argument.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I don't like to use it, and because exactly, it's a bad argument.
Right. It's funny. It kind of presupposes that a person can be a knot of ideas that don't become paradoxical in a sense.
Oh yeah, which is obviously true, right? Like we can all compartmentalize and have sort of inconsistent and sometimes even hypocritical
and we do,
opinions
sure.
and views and motivations, right?
Let's talk about the media misrepresenting his position briefly. I don't know if you guys saw the interview with on the BBC with Kathy Newman.
Yeah. That was a bad moment for the media there.
That was a clusterfuck of an interview.
Yeah.
Because he's explaining in detail what his position is, right? And she's just straw manning him at every opportunity. So you're saying
this is the problem with like trying to take a shortcut, right? To trying to take a shortcut to discrediting him or people like him that that they think are helping an extreme kind of
Yeah.
right-wing fringe or something.
Yeah, like she had a motivation from the very beginning
Yeah.
of this interview. Like she wanted to tear him down from the very, very beginning.
What was the main moment there?
There's like it just kept coming back to, well, no, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what you're misrepresenting my ideas. And at some point she's like, you're a provocateur. He's like, what are you talking about? You're the one who's like blasting me here. Like, that was one moment. I don't know if that's the one you were referring to, but
Have you guys ever been interviewed by the media
No.
to see how it comes out at the end?
Yeah. It must.
It's not good. Like,
It
I
must
don't know
never
if any-
come out good.
I
because
don't
the whole
know if
idea
anyone's
is to
ever been
try to-
interviewed and went, yeah, that came out really good. You know,
Yeah.
like generally you look at it and go, holy fuck, that's not what I meant. Oh man, that's out of context. Like the media is just looking for sound bites to try and.
that's what like, I was interviewed for something. I can't remember what it was, but like it was like a 5-minute discussion with this reporter, and at the end of it, she used one little phrase that I said. I think it was like, "Yeah, that sounds good" or something. Just this little sound.
Yeah. Suddenly, Mark sucks dick, and like that's all it gets across in the interview after he spoke 5 minutes about something else, kind of thing.
important.
Yeah,
For
yeah,
the
something-
record, I do not suck dick. Just putting that out there. Not that there's anything wrong with. I'm just gonna stop. But yeah, like that interview was just awful. It was an awful interview. It was like probably one of the worst examples of media behavior that I've
or
ever seen.
best examples, depending on how you
Or
want to look
best.
at it.
Yeah, that's it. Because he actually managed to render her speechless, and you can see on her face that she screwed up, and
Yeah.
and that it became obvious to everybody who's watching.
Right.
Not.
Did he look smug? Did he get a smug
Actually,
smug?
he didn't really look that smug,
good.
which is why it has sort of some significance in
I think
terms
it-
of a moment.
I think
that
he looked
we
more
can look at.
irritated throughout the entire interview than anything else.
Yeah.
I was irritated watching it. It
Well,
was,
it's difficult not to. I'm sure it must be very difficult for him to not want to Jean-Claude Van Damme get up and just go, you know what, fuck this whole thing. What the fuck,
Yeah.
you know?
There was a monk debate that he did recently, MUNK. Have you heard of these monk debates?
Mm-hmm.
So in Toronto, sometimes they set up these debates on sort of big kind of deep questions that are in the zeitgeist. So they've done like is there a God debates with Hitchens and stuff in the past before he died. I'm pretty sure
Yeah,
Hitchens.
yeah.
Was part of them, and they've and recently they did one with Jordan Peterson and Stephen Fry. Do you know who Stephen Fry is? The comedian and
was like a
and
2-hour
writer
debate.
and
Yeah.
TV host. Yeah,
Yeah, it's
and that debate was about was it political correctness?
yeah.
I think
I think it was.
the debate, debating whether or not basically the validity of political correctness was kind of the debate there. And Stephen Fry was on the same side as Jordan Peterson, and on the other side there were two people. I think one of them is a New York Times reporter, and there was another guy who's sort of a public intellectual in the States, but I don't remember exactly what his affiliations are. But anyway, he was like sort of directly calling Jordan Peterson like just an old bitter white guy, and basically like sort of straight up calling him a racist on stage, rather than actually addressing the arguments. And that was kind of an unfortunate moment, because the side that was defending political correctness definitely lost a lot of their credibility just in that one moment, right?
Yeah.
Because they couldn't, because he couldn't resist sort of
Turning to the dark side.
stretching and exaggerating or trying to
Oh yeah, well, Gilles, you're a poopy head.
yeah, exactly. It reduced it to that. Like instead of demolishing the arguments of Jordan Peterson, that was just a straight up ad hominem kind of attack. And this seems to be indicative of most of the way anyone who's not already left leaning deals with somebody like Jordan Peterson.
I find, I can't help but think, wouldn't it be nice if people were having the same discussions? Like, anytime I've seen him go up against someone, he's having a separate discussion. He's talking his circle, and then the other person's talking their invasive circle, trying to make it look like he's saying something, and then he's going, no, I'm just saying this, and the person's going,
That's why
yes, but it's doing this, and then he's going, yeah, but really I'm just trying to avoid doing this.
That's why I liked his discussion with Matt Dillahunty, because it was a conversation.
It was an actual conversation.
Yeah, they were like, at one point Matt's like, okay, now we're closer to being on the same page. Like, they're actually talking about these ideas
and
in
then
a civil fashion.
They can build up a substance there and see what remains.
Right.
Kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Even though by the end of it, Dillahunty was just like, well, you're another apologist. They still talked about the same thing, like you're saying. Right.
Another good conversation I saw was with Brett Weinstein, who's an evolutionary biologist and also a straight up liberal, like leftist guy who was a Bernie supporter and all that kind of stuff. And they had a really good conversation on Joe Rogan's podcast, and it just seems like the interviews that we get presented with the most are the ones in the mainstream media, where and it's mostly those ones where what you end up seeing is that kind of talking past each other stuff.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, it's the sensationalization of the media.
That's it.
Like, news is just sensational. Like, they're just trying to sell some good times. It's not news. It's just entertainment.
Infotainment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I can't believe still what happened this week with this Morgan Freeman story.
Right.
Oh,
like, this is CNN
story?
just basically throwing in the towel on any pretense of non-tabloidism now. It's like they got tired of trying not to be
trying to be impartial,
of trying not to be what the right wingers were falsely accusing them of being. I say falsely because I think they've exaggerated the degree to which CNN is like.
It makes a better story.
So anyway, with the Morgan Freeman thing, you've got these two reporters that came out saying, basically making a big like this is a story moment right now. This is a news cycle moment, and we have. We're presenting examples of Morgan Freeman being a sexual harasser or a sexual deviant or predator or whatever. Basically saying, hey, we've caught a rapist.
They blew up the story.
Yeah. But when you actually look at the substance of what they're accusing him of, all they've got is that he's evincing the old-fashioned attitude that an 85-year-old guy who did live in a society that was kind of patriarchal would kind of naturally have. He's just flirted with people in a way that's creepy or not picking up on cues maybe of the other person that might not be reciprocating, but like the things that they presented as evidence of it actually was, one, a video of him flirting with somebody where it was being kind of tossed back and forth, them doing like jokey, flirty comments back and forth. And then the other thing was like the reporter who wrote this article, her big piece of evidence and what she calls one of the more egregious transgressions of Morgan Freeman is him saying, I wish I was there. And she's claiming that she was like 6 months pregnant. She was 6 months pregnant when she was doing this interview with him and Michael Caine and Alan Arkin, because of some movie that's coming out. And she's accusing Morgan Freeman of having been inappropriately making that comment, saying like he was making some kind of sexually suggestive
it's
comment
I wanted to be
towards
there
her.
when you conceived the birth of this child.
Yeah, so she's...
If my penis had been there,
No, I think
that would have been great.
I think what she's implying, or what she's pretending, or what she thinks she heard is, or what she thinks that meant was he wants his penis to be inside her right then, or something like that. But
yeah.
But when you actually look at the video and the context of it, Michael Caine is telling some story about sticking his foot in his mouth and congratulating some woman who wasn't pregnant for being pregnant, right? And then that's when Morgan Freeman says, "Oh, I wish
I'd been there to see you embarrass yourself." Right.
And in this crazy reporter's mind, because the three interviewees are facing the reporter, and Morgan Freeman happened to say that while he was looking at her, it means that he was making some kind of harassment comment, and not actually in the context that everyone can see that was in. He's saying he wished he was there to see Michael Caine stick his foot in his mouth.
I find a big problem with the political correct movement is that there is someone assuming that they've understand exactly what you've meant.
Right.
Yeah.
And that what they believe you meant is what it is actually meant.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the problem with this kind of sensationalized reporting is obviously context. They'll take something totally out of context and just blow it up because it backs up their sensationalized story. And like we see this, like the example that you just gave, Jill, of the whole Morgan Freeman thing is virtually identical to that video of Peterson with him refusing to use the student's pronouns. They take this one thing out of context and just use it and circulate that out of context to back up what they're saying.
And dishonestly hide the qualifications and the actual nature of the argument that's there, right?
Yeah, I don't know what happened before that one clip. I don't know what happened. I don't know what the context was. Right? All we're seeing is like, no, I'm not going to use your what. Shouldn't people ask what the context is? Mm-hmm. Shouldn't they dig a little deeper to find out if this is the argument that he's putting forward, if this is actually his position, or is there something else behind it? And like with someone as controversial as Peterson, that becomes more and more important, right? Don't just look at what's being circulated on Facebook or on Twitter or in some meme or whatever, and just look into his actual position.
Yeah, but I mean, these positions always go beyond that. I mean, we'd have to basically hang out with him to know if he's a good guy, and we'd have to be exposed to this guy to find out where he's coming from and stuff like that.
All it takes is to read an article he wrote or whatever, or have a look at the book in context to see what we're talking about.
Well, I'm going to use his own argument and suggest that even that's not enough, in the sense that there is always an undertone that someone may not be aware of. So, for example, he may be presenting an argument, but there is more to the argument that isn't presented as well. And what I'm suggesting is that it always does go a little deeper.
Well, of course it does. But if you're looking superficially at something that he said, something like the pronoun thing, and you just take that as a representation of his full position on that one issue, you're misrepresenting what he's saying.
Sure.
And to that level, just to that extent, you should be looking into A, the context, and B, what his position really is.
Yeah, it certainly, it was presupposed that he had some sort of ill will.
Right,
which is not necessarily the case, kind of thing.
Right. I don't think it is necessarily the case. It might be. I don't know. I don't know enough about him to say that he either has an intention behind it or he doesn't. The only thing I can say for sure is that he was opposed to Bill C-16 because he didn't want the government legislating what people can and can't say.
Yeah.
And
it was a matter of free speech.
Right. I know that for a matter of fact. That was his position on C-16, didn't want to support it, fine.
Yeah.
I also know within or out of context that he refused to use somebody's preferred pronoun. Beyond that, I have no idea why. I have no idea what the motivation was. And I would need to look into it before I condemn him.
He's even quoted as saying, it depends how the person approaches me with what they want to be referred to as.
Right.
Maybe I'll choose to call them whatever they're choosing. It all depends on how they present it. If there's a political agenda that I'm sensing behind it, all this stuff. I don't know exactly how he
like if somebody comes up and introduces themselves as Michael, and you say, "Oh, hi, Mike," and they say, I actually prefer to be called Michael. I go by Michael. I don't go by Mike.
Yeah.
Like, most of the time you'll comply, right? And you'll be like, "Oh, okay, Michael. Hey, Michael."
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if that whole thing comes actually as like an adversarial, like, "You fucking asshole, I go by Mike."
Yeah. Michael.
Yeah.
-775.
Yeah, I mean, in a case
better
like
remember
that,
that.
I'm like, "Well, fuck you, Mike."
And I think that was Peterson's reaction. I think this is...
It's a more basic kind of interpersonal social thing.
This is hearsay. This is
Which
like...
he may not be very skilled at, we're going to say.
That's right.
From what I hear, someone told me the fuller context of that video, and from what I hear, that's exactly the problem. Is the person was being aggressive, they were being confrontational when they like insisted that he used that pronoun.
Well, and maybe so that the person thinks that it is an attack.
Right.
Because they're gathering some other thing from what he's doing than what is the case. It's different in their mind than it is in Peterson's mind. He's not thinking these things. That person is thinking those things.
Yeah, because they're projecting a motive that might not necessarily be that motive.
Yeah. I also want to make it clear that, while I may be superficially defending some of his positions, I'm also criticizing his other positions. Mm-hmm. But none of this should be construed as me being in favor of discrimination against transgender people. That could not be further from the truth.
Yeah,
and
right.
By defending some of his positions, I get the distinct impression that some on the radical left will immediately condemn what I'm saying as a defense of Peterson's, just whole cloth.
Sure.
Right?
No, as a defense of
bigotry,
of anti-transgender bigotry,
right?
Because they first made the conclusion that Peterson is just a crypto anti-transgender bigot.
Right. They came into it with that assumption.
Yeah.
Just right away, they've already labeled him as public enemy number one.
Yeah.
And anyone who defends him for any reason is in the same camp. That's just not. That's faulty reasoning, and it's completely detrimental to any kind of actual conversation. So again, my position on Jordan Peterson is I don't have a position on Jordan Peterson. I am opposed to his presuppositionalist religious apologism.
Yeah. I'm
opposed for obvious reasons.
So nobody's actually being an apologist for Jordan Peterson. What we want to do is actually have the balls to deal directly with the arguments of Jordan.
That's
Peterson.
exactly it. Right. Like.
All right. Sorry. Actually, that was kind of gender normative. That have the balls.
Have the balls.
That was not. That was not an ideal.
Have the genitals to address the arguments.
Or non-genital.
Or
have the
non-genital.
spine.
That's offensive to non-spinal people now.
Is that vertebratist?
That's totally vertebratist.
Okay,
You're
sorry.
a vertebratist.
To have the
Without even knowing it.
audacity to address the
Sure,
arguments. Let's go there.
Yeah.
That's as neutral as we can get.
The
courage, the fortitude to address the arguments.
Yeah.
And that's
I don't want to be cowardist, but
But that's what
have
should
the
be done.
intellectual courage to discuss the actual arguments and not divine motives and
Right.
Well, and I would suggest that
and play the lazy shortcut game.
He points to evidence that unless there is a respect that is, in a sense, established first, communication does diminish and fall away very rapidly.
Yeah,
and,
you got to start
everyone
off
just
on
thinks
It's like
everyone
that,
hates everyone. Like
It's like the I don't know if it's a common saying, but I've heard it that respect is a given, disrespect is earned.
I like that.
Right? So ultimately the idea there is that there's a basic amount of respect that everybody needs to be like a respect attitude that everybody needs to have with each other when dealing with each other socially.
Once you break that social
But
contract,
once you break that once you break that contract, then you're justified in removing that respect or denying that respect.
right.
Well, then the conversation closes.
That's it. You're shutting down the
Because you have to have that mutual respect to even be able to begin to speak and in a sense lay down the terms and meanings of things. Okay, if we're going to talk about God, what do we mean by that? Let's define things. Okay, now let's approach it and start talking respectfully about it.
And that's part of the problem that I have with the presuppositionalist. That presuppositionalist argument, or even the atheist alternate or counterpart to that, of like saying, you're arguing for this, but you just don't know that you actually believe the opposite. Mm-hmm. I think that's just a manifestation of the disrespect thing, because you're like one of my. What I think is like most important in any kind of argumentation exercise of like two people coming together to kind of hash out opposing views to try and try and evince some understanding that comes closer to the truth or something. Mm-hmm. You got to have the principle of charity, mm-hmm. right? You got to come to it with the presumption that everybody's being earnest about their motives, and that the arguments being presented are just what they are,
right?
And all these kinds of games of trying to be too clever by half in determining like that. Oh no, you're only saying this as a lie because you actually believe the opposite, and you're just trying to advance some kind of
I'm thinking that
agenda or something.
The principle of charity is, I think with.
You take the person's argument in the best possible light.
Right. But within this polarized political atmosphere that we've been living in for the past couple of years, the principle of charity has kind of taken a backseat to immediate reactionism.
Yeah.
Right? You're either with us or you're against us. And if you're against us, we're going to go after you no matter what. And that's especially true on social media.
Because it looks better and you score more points if you
if you can
get a clip of you demolishing
right
somebody else. I fucking hate that stuff. Every second video I see is so and so demolishes so and so.
Or
that's
so
like
and
the
so
most
destroys
garbage.
blah blah blah.
I would suggest that our society rewards this sociopathic behavior, though. No,
I think it's become
that's why
it's becoming increasingly manifest. Trump, for example, is. I think he's become a catalyst for that, more so than what we've seen in the past. We're getting a lot more, people being rewarded for just being a fucking asshole for no reason.
And so I see like a blind spot there with like Jordan Peterson, who actually seems to be giving aid and comfort to that side of the whole political landscape that like supports Trump and that is the Trump phenomenon. Mm-hmm. While at the same time, I find that a perfect example of the kind of the whole accelerationist idea behind supporting Trump, where what you want to do is you want to vote for him because it's essentially like burning everything to the ground.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And let's start fresh and see what comes out after, because what we have now is corrupted.
The Steve Bannon approach.
Yeah. So like, isn't that perfectly encapsulating what Jordan Peterson is arguing he's against, which is the kind of neglectful dismissal of established structures, mm-hmm. right? That might have a use despite flaws or things about them that we don't like.
Yeah, he makes that argument in favor of religion, because he sees Western civilization as being fundamentally rooted in Catholicism specifically.
Yeah.
And if we get rid of that institution whole cloth, then things will devolve into chaos.
Yeah.
Right. It's another one of those classic religious apologist arguments, which I don't think there's any real merit behind it. While Western civilization may have been heavily influenced in the past by Catholicism and Christianity in general, removing it today just because of the progress that we've made away from religious superstition won't rob us of anything more than just more superstition. I think in a lot of places, especially in places like Canada or Denmark or other heavily secular countries, the move away from religion won't have that much of a deleterious effect.
Well, I was speaking to someone yesterday about this, and they brought up Daniel Dennett and his argument that he makes, like in Breaking the Spell, which is actually not quite so dismissive of the idea that there might be some kind of benefit that religious institution is bringing to the social psychology.
Right. Like organized religion brings community for one thing. Like there are good things inherent within the foundation of religion as part of our society. Like it brings people together, it's charitable, blah 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 blah. But you can have those things without the institution of religion.
Sure, but you have to. But before destroying the institution of religion, you have to first understand what it is that institution of religion is bringing to the table.
Right, of course. And I think that's going to become more of an important conversation as we move into the future. Like a lot of people are abandoning religion because they're finding it kind of lacking, I guess, of any real substance, but they feel disenfranchised or a little bit lost when they start to question their religion because they're so fundamentally rooted in religious upbringing. It's been part of their lives forever. It becomes, again, that identity question that we've talked about before. It's so deeply ingrained in their persona that just abandoning it altogether will just turn their world around. And I think Peterson makes an argument to that effect, that if you get rid of it, the individual will be unfulfilled.
Well, and possibly so. I know that he had an interest in Nietzsche and ideas and stuff like that, and Nietzsche divided up society in terms of, or the powers that be, in terms of like the Dionysian versus Apollo sort of thing, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I guess what I'm wondering is, what is this idea? What is this fear of chaos? What is he defining as chaos, this Peterson guy? Like, because he certainly seems to be afraid of chaos, or whatever he's calling chaos. And I'm understanding that he's coming from a psychology background in terms of what you think you know. You may not.
I think. I think one big aspect of his thing is to critically analyze the wars of the 20th century, the world wars, and the whole rise of totalitarianism and fascism and mass murder of big chunks of the world population. Like that's what he characterizes as chaos, I think, and that's what he imagines.
That's what he's also seemingly accidentally emulating.
In what way?
In the way that he's selling himself, I guess you can say, right? He's looking like he's Big Brother up there with like posters of himself doing his speeches at his rallies and stuff like that. I don't know if you know what I mean, like the advertisements for his speeches that he gives or whatever. He looks like he's accidentally becoming a fascist.
Right. Yeah, like making use of.
And I find it interesting that you could use his own argument of the unconscious things that are accidentally occurring that he's not aware of, sort of thing. He's accidentally becoming a fascist. He's accidentally becoming the thing that he hates and is actually speaking against.
Yeah, I mean, there might be some sort of superficial aspects to the Jordan Peterson phenomenon that adopt
I'm trying to reduce them to signs and symbols.
right. That adopt signs and symbols that are common to the fascist movements of the 20th century or whatever. But it seems like when I'm actually watching the videos of him like discussing with people and arguing with people and the kind of arguments he's making, it's not actually a fascist thing that he's putting forward. He's not trying.
Well, what is this chaos that he's talking about, that he's trying to avoid? What is he suggesting is solid here? I'm not exactly sure. It sounds like he's speaking on behalf of, if we're going to evolve, let's do it slowly and consciously. Otherwise, it's chaos.
No, he brings up constantly like some metaphysical angle, and so I think there's like a more of a kind of spiritualist aspect to,
It's
or
definitely
spiritual
part of it,
aspect to it. So like,
I think the chaos thing specifically is, if we get rid of religion, then people will be free to just go out and murder and steal and whatever. That's the kind of chaos I think he's talking about. I think. Not sure.
Okay, so he is in
like
a sense...
he's saying that by getting rid of some of these establishment structures, by getting rid of them, we won't make use of the underlying, the foundational sort of meanings and stuff. If we deliberately ignore the foundational meanings that do naturally emerge in ourselves, or that we do naturally end up making use of, if we don't deliberately ignore them, then society works, I guess. But if we do ignore them and deliberately put them aside, then that's when everything falls to shit. When people find out, or people will end up acting as though it doesn't matter if they just murder someone because they cut him off, or
Right.
So final thoughts on Jordan Peterson. Luke, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, I don't like to have final thoughts concerning anyone and anything, but I mean, in terms of what I've seen of him, I would rather just focus on this mutual respect for to have a real discussion, sort of thing. And I think that we can see that people that he has had some sort of a mutual respect thing going on with, the conversation flows better. I've seen him in try to enter into a conversation and it just didn't work, sort of thing. So I don't know if it has to do with social graces or whatever. But I mean, the guy has gotten into trouble, and I think that if he had had better social graces, this wouldn't have happened, because sure. I don't think he's necessarily representing anything that's I don't know.
I think the guy has some sophisticated, detailed arguments to present and to be played with in a philosophical sense, in exploring these kind of mechanisms and dynamics of humanity and how it's manifested.
So we can say he's a skilled academic. He can write out an essay, and we go,
I think
okay,
he's that,
great
but
conclusion.
I think his overarching project can actually be seen to be a familiar one that's actually not much more than like a presuppositionalist and kind of divine command type of perspective, which I think is wrong for reasonable reasons.
Right. And I think you agree, Mark.
I do absolutely agree. I think it's important to When it comes to, like it or not, Jordan Peterson is now a public intellectual.
Yeah.
He's in the public sphere, and he's causing waves, and there's no getting rid of him, right? So we need to not publicly lynch somebody. If you have a problem with what they're saying, address the arguments themselves, and don't just dismiss them outright because you've already pre-painted them as a bigot or somebody who's out to, reel in more people from the alt-right, quote unquote. His arguments need to be taken at face value, and if you have a problem with those, address the argument with a counter-argument that you yourself have formulated.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just attacking somebody and using ad hominems, which is faulty reasoning, and no truth can be arrived from.
Yeah, and you're just engaging in a meaningless contest of two arbitrary powers in conflict, right?
Right.
Like, yeah.
Yeah.
I think a big problem with the overall kind of more radical activist movements on either side is that they're just trying to win, and they're not doing the work of actually constructing a more honest kind of intellectual argument and exploration of what actually is the more sound or valid perspective or
Right.
things like that.
Like it isn't about winning. It's about the arguments.
Yeah.
And it's about
And
having the conversation and not diverging from that because you've already come up with an idea, right? My critique of Peterson is aimed squarely at the religious aspect, the religious apologism, the presuppositionalism.
Well, hold on. You're aiming it there to win, though.
No, I'm critiquing him about that.
Yes, but to win yourself.
What do you mean?
Like you're critiquing it.
Right. Because I have a problem with the arguments that he's putting forward.
Right. And then that becomes your win, his loss.
Not necessarily. It's just I'm critiquing it because I disagree with what he's saying.
Right.
And that's where it ends. Like, it's not about winning an argument against Jordan Peterson. It's about criticizing that one specific idea that I happen to disagree with. And if other people want to listen to what I'm saying, great. Otherwise, no skin off my back. And if Jordan Peterson would ever like to, be on the show and discuss those presuppositionalist ideas, love to have him. This has been Critical Junction episode 40. I'm Mark.
I'd rather have Kermit. I'm Luke.
I'm Jill.
As always, thanks for listening, and until next time, keep thinking critically.